I moved to a remote mountainous stretch of Maine about 4 years ago. It was the first time I had ever truly lived alone, and honestly, it was a change that was long overdue. My parents had been breathing down my neck for years about finding my own way, and when I stumbled upon this place, tucked away on a ridge where the nearest neighbor was a grueling walk away, I knew I'd found my antisocial paradise. For the first few years, it was uneventful in the best way possible. I kept to myself, went to work, came home, and didn't bother a soul. I never even learned the names of the people living in the surrounding hills. Out here, you can go weeks without seeing another human being, and that was exactly how I liked it. Everything changed on a late afternoon in January. I was still at the office when the snow began to fall. At first, it looked like a typical dusting, but within an hour, it had escalated into a full-blown whiteout. The wind picked up, visibility dropped to near zero, and the mountain roads started getting dangerous. My boss eventually told everyone to head home, before the passes became impassable. I drive a heavy 4x4, so I wasn't too worried about the trek back. I've handled bad weather before, but by the time I finally pulled into my driveway, I was purely relieved to be home. However, when I went to unlock my front door, my heart sank. My electronic smart lock was frozen solid, completely paralyzed by the sub-zero temperatures. I stood there for a minute, processing the situation, then tried again, but the mechanism wouldn't budge. I didn't have a lighter or any way to generate enough heat to thaw the lock. I tried breathing on it, cupping my hands around the metal, even banging on it out of pure frustration. Nothing worked. I retreated to my truck and sat there, unsure of what to do. The heater was blasting, and I told myself I'd just wait out the peak of the storm. Maybe it would die down in an hour or two. But as I watched through the windshield, the snow only fell harder. After 10 minutes, I realized I was making a fatal mistake. My truck was already being buried, and the longer I waited, the worse my options became. I had to walk to the nearest house. After 20 minutes of struggling against winds that felt like they were trying to snap my ribs, I saw a small, weathered cabin. I pounded on the door as hard as I could. It swung open so violently that I actually took a step back. The man standing there looked to be about 60, with a gaunt, nondescript face that looked like crumpled parchment. He introduced himself as Elias. I explained my situation, and he nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in. I should have felt relieved, but something about him felt off from the start. The house was warm, but as he offered me a seat, I noticed his behavior. His eyes kept darting around the room, from me to the floor to the ceiling, then to a spot over my shoulder, as if he were tracking something invisible moving behind me. He couldn't focus on the conversation either. He'd be mid-sentence and then just trail off, staring at the wall like he was looking through it. Feeling deeply unsettled, I told him I was exhausted and asked if I could just get some sleep. He seemed almost relieved and pointed to an old sofa in the corner. When I asked to turn out the light, he flicked the switch without argument, but then he just stood there, in the dark doorway for what felt like a full minute, silent and unmoving. I lay on the sofa with my eyes half closed, trying to look like I was asleep, but my adrenaline was spiked. About an hour in, I heard it. A rhythmic thumping and a distinct scratching sound, coming from inside the wooden wall right behind my head. At first, I told myself it was just branches or the house settling, but the sounds were too deliberate. This was a one-story cabin. There was no upstairs, and no reason for anything to be moving behind that specific section of the wall. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, a massive thump echoed right behind the sofa. I bolted upright, and there was Elias standing in the doorway again, watching me in the dark. Before I could say a word, he literally charged at me. We rolled around on the floor in a chaotic struggle. Elias was freakishly strong, and he went straight for my throat. As he squeezed, he started screaming at me to stop fighting. He kept raving about his daughter, saying she had been lonely in the dark for too long and that she would love the company. With a final burst of desperation, I managed to shove him off, grabbed my coat, and dove out the front door. I ran through the blinding snow, hearing Elias shriek behind me. "She won't let you leave! She's hungry!" I ran until I reached the next house, belonging to a family named the Millers. The next morning, when I told them what had happened, Mr. Miller's face went pale. "You were at Elias's place?" he asked quietly. He told me that 8 years ago, Elias's young daughter had vanished without a trace. The local whisper was that Elias had kept her close, hiding her remains within the very walls of that cabin. I sat there in silence, remembering the scratching sounds from inside the wood. I reported the incident, but the police found nothing unusual. 3 years have passed, and I still live in the area, but every time I drive past that hillside, my skin crawls. I still see the Millers, but I never stay past dark. The thought of what Elias did, and what might still be lonely inside those walls, is a shadow that will never leave me. This happened 2 winters ago, during a storm the locals called the White Widow. I'm 30, and at the time I was living alone in a converted barn house on the edge of Lake Willoughby, Vermont. As a freelance architect, my office is essentially a drafting table and a high-end laptop, so I rarely have a reason to leave my property once the temperature drops below zero. The weather reports had been screaming about this particular blizzard for nearly a week. Usually I ignore the hype, but when I saw the sky turn a bruised, sickly purple by noon, I knew this wasn't just another dusting. I made a quick run to the local market for supplies, grabbing enough wood, canned goods, and coffee to last a month, and then I hunkered down to watch the world disappear. By 7 p.m., the wind was so violent that the entire barn seemed to groan under the pressure. It's a haunting sound, the way the wind whistles through the old timber, making the house feel like it's being squeezed by a giant. I was sitting by the fireplace, trying to focus on a set of blueprints, when I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a sharp, mechanical thud, followed by a rhythmic, metallic clicking. I figured a branch had snapped and hit the generator shed, so I ignored it. But about 10 minutes later, a car horn echoed through the valley. It wasn't a desperate blast, but a series of weak, stuttering honks, like someone was tapping the wheel with a trembling hand. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window in my loft and looked out. At the very end of my long, private driveway, I could see the dim, flickering glow of headlights. The snow was so thick it looked like a wall of static, but I could just make out the silhouette of an old sedan tilted into the ditch. I stood there for a long time, watching for movement. My first instinct was to go out and help, but the temperature was already 40 below with a wind chill, and I could barely see the porch railing, let alone the end of the drive. I decided to wait, hoping they'd manage to dig themselves out or call for a tow. At exactly 11:15 p.m., there was a knock at my front door. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was a slow, deliberate 3-hit knock. I didn't open it. I walked to the door and asked through the wood, "Who is it?" A man's voice answered, sounding calm, yet slightly strained. He said his name was Arthur, and that he'd slid off the road into the ditch. He asked if he could just come in to warm up while he waited for a tow truck. I felt a wave of guilt. If he'd really walked from the end of my drive in this weather, he should have been at the onset of hypothermia. I reached for the deadbolt, but something made me stop. I decided to keep the security chain engaged and only cracked the door an inch. The man standing on my porch was dressed in a heavy wool overcoat, and he was covered in a thick layer of white frost. He was shorter than I expected, and he stood with his head slightly bowed. He repeated his request, saying his phone was dead and he just needed a landline. I was about to unlatch the chain when I looked down. The man was standing on my welcome mat, and even in the dim porch light, I could see his boots. They were black, polished leather dress boots, and they were spotless. There wasn't a single flake of snow on them. No salt stains, no slush, not even a drop of moisture. If he had walked up my driveway, he would have been waist-deep in snow. His boots should have been caked in ice, but they looked like they had just come out of a box. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the wind ran down my spine. I told him I'd call the state police for him, but that I wasn't letting anyone in tonight. His posture changed instantly. He didn't plead. He didn't argue. He just leaned his forehead against the door and whispered, "It's so much warmer inside, Julian." He knew my name. I slammed the door and threw every lock I had. I scrambled for my phone and dialed 911, explaining that a stranger was trying to force his way in. While I was on the phone, I heard the heavy, rhythmic crunch of footsteps moving off the porch, heading toward the side of the house. The operator told me to stay in a room with a lockable door. She said the nearest cruiser was 20 miles away, and the roads were nearly impassable for them, too. I retreated to my upstairs bedroom, grabbing a heavy framing hammer from my tool belt on the way. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. For 20 minutes, there was nothing but the wind. Then, I heard a sharp clink against the glass of my bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't want him to know which room I was in. But then came the banging. It started at the back door, a violent, rhythmic slamming that made the entire barn frame vibrate. He wasn't just knocking anymore. He was trying to kick the door off its hinges. Suddenly, the car horn at the end of the driveway started again. But it wasn't a tap this time. It was one long, continuous morning blast that went on for minutes. When the police finally arrived an hour later, the man was gone. They found the sedan at the end of my drive, but it wasn't Arthur's car. It was a vehicle that had been reported stolen from a town 3 hours away. The engine was stone cold, and the keys were missing. The officers confirmed what I had feared. There were no footprints leading from that car to my house. The snow between the road and my porch was perfectly smooth and undisturbed. But there were footprints circling my house, starting and ending at the edge of the driveway, as if he had been dropped off by a second vehicle that had driven away in the dark. The next morning, after the sun came out and the wind died down, I went outside to inspect the damage. I found something the police had missed in the dark. On the exterior glass of my loft window, 12 feet off the ground, were 2 muddy handprints. He hadn't been standing on the ground when he was watching me. He had been on a ladder, or he had climbed the siding. A few days later, the news reported that a cabin on the other side of the lake had been cleaned out during the storm. No jewelry or electronics were taken, but all the family photos had been cut out of their frames, and the homeowner's Sunday dress clothes were missing. I still live in that barn house, but I've installed motion-activated floodlights and a reinforced steel door. I often think about those polished boots. He wasn't looking for a phone or a tow. He was looking for a new life, and he wanted mine. I've only told this story to a handful of people in my entire life. My wife, my brother, and a fellow racer who I knew wouldn't laugh me out of the room. I'm sharing it here because, as I approach my 40th birthday, I've realized that some things in this world simply don't have a rational explanation. And I've finally made peace with that. I'm 31 now, and I live near Silverton, Colorado. For most of my early 20s, I was a professional downhill skier, competing in the Europa Cup, and even flirting with the Olympic qualifiers. I spent 6 years throwing myself down icy mountains at 80 miles per hour until my knees decided they'd had enough. There was no single career-ending crash, just the slow, grinding wear of a life spent on the edge of a blade. Retiring from the circuit didn't mean I quit the sport. If anything, it freed me from the gates and the timers. I started chasing backcountry lines, the kind of terrain where there are no chairlifts, no crowds, and no safety nets. I say this because I need you to understand. I wasn't some weekend tourist. I was avalanche certified. I carried a beacon, a probe, and a shovel, and I knew the San Juan Mountains like the back of my hand. It was a Tuesday in late February. The forecast called for a light dusting, maybe 3 inches. Nothing that would pose a threat to an experienced solo skier. I reached the trailhead just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the peaks. I strapped on my skins and began the long, rhythmic climb up the northern face of Red Mountain. About halfway up, the wind shifted. It didn't just pick up, it changed its entire character. It started coming from the northeast, bringing a bitter, bone-chilling cold that the weather reports hadn't mentioned. Visibility began to drop at an alarming rate, the world turning into a shifting, monochromatic blur of white and gray. The smart move would have been to peel my skins and ski back to the truck immediately. But I was already at the top of a couloir I'd been dreaming about for months. Just one run, I whispered to myself. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times. I knew the risks. I knew the snowpack was temperamental, but I let my ego drive. I dropped in, and for the first 10 seconds, it was perfect. Then, the world shifted. It wasn't a roar. It was a soft, sickening crack, like a dry branch snapping under a heavy foot. Before I could even think to deploy my airbag, the entire slope beneath me turned into a moving river of white. If you've never been caught in a slide, it's impossible to describe the terror. You aren't just falling, you're being chewed up by the earth itself. I was tossed like a rag doll for 50 yards before my body slammed into a buried outcrop of rock. The deceleration was instant, and the pain in my left leg was so sharp it nearly knocked me unconscious. When the snow finally settled, I wasn't buried, but I was broken. My left ski was gone, snapped off at the binding, and my leg was twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the darkening sky as the blizzard truly began to howl. I was miles from the nearest road, my leg was shattered, and the temperature was dropping into the single digits. I had 3 choices, and all of them felt like a death sentence. I could stay and wait for a rescue that wouldn't come for days. I could try to dig a snow cave with one hand, or I could move. I chose to move. Using my one remaining ski pole as a crutch, I began to drag myself downhill through the deepening powder. Every movement was agony, a white-hot flare of pain that radiated from my hip to my toes. I was losing hope, feeling the first stages of hypothermia numbing my fingers, when I saw him. A figure emerged from the curtain of snow, moving effortlessly toward me. He was a skier, dressed in an old, faded blue shell that looked like it belonged in the late 90s. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that my brain was finally shutting down. But he reached me within seconds, pulling off his goggles to reveal a pair of calm, gray eyes. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just knelt down, slung my arm over his shoulder, and said, "We need to go, Marcus." The weird thing was, I hadn't told him my name. For the next hour, we moved as one. He supported nearly all of my weight, guiding me through the trees and across the treacherous flats with a strength that felt unnatural. I tried to talk to him, to thank him, but my voice was a raspy whisper. I remember asking him where he had come from. He looked straight ahead, his breath not even misting in the freezing air, and said, "I haven't felt the weight of the snow in a long time. It's good to be back on solid ground." I didn't understand what he meant. I just assumed he was another backcountry enthusiast who had seen me fall. We reached a sheltered grove of pines, and I told him I needed to rest for just a second. I leaned my back against a trunk and closed my eyes, just for a few heartbeats. When I opened them, he was gone. I screamed for him. I searched the whiteout with my eyes, expecting to see his blue jacket, but there was nothing. I looked down at the snow, expecting to see 2 sets of tracks, but there was only one. Mine. The deep, messy furrow where I had dragged my broken leg was there, but the snow beside it was perfectly smooth. It was as if I had been floating. I don't know how I made it the rest of the way. Adrenaline and sheer terror carried me to the trailhead where a ranger's truck happened to be passing by. A week later, while I was recovering in the hospital from a compound fracture, I started digging through local archives. I found a clipping from a local paper dated 3 years ago. A skier named Soren Vance, an expert who knew the San Juans as well as I did, had gone missing on Red Mountain during a February blizzard. They never found his body. There was a photo of him at the bottom of the article. He was wearing a faded blue shell, and he had the same calm, gray eyes that had looked into mine in the middle of that storm. I still ski, though my leg aches when the weather turns cold. But I never go out alone anymore, because I know that while the mountains are beautiful, they are filled with shadows. And sometimes, those shadows are the only reason you make it home.